A lot of the loans could be, I'm going to quote, but around 80,000, which is unheard of for a home. The co-op has about 68 affordable housing units. And so HomeSite will, of course, be the builder on those units. And then we come alongside and provide that lending, which is a very collaborative type of model to be able to do.
Community FIs play a critical role in addressing underserved populations. One of the larger impacts they have is the financing that results in homeownership. Washington State's Verity Credit Union is an $800 million CDFI mission focused on addressing just that need. With us today to talk about their initiatives and the barriers to those outcomes is Ziquora Banks, Chief Impact Strategy Officer. Ziquora, thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rich.
So why don't you tell us just a little bit about the history of Verity and kind of what brought you to, this kind of mission focused in Seattle or in Washington State at this time?
Yeah, so Verity has been around since the 1930s, much like many credit unions that came around the Great Depression, really to serve a need and address a lot of inequities that existed at that time, right? So for Verity, it was postal workers coming together and pooling their resources to really lend out. You fast forward to modern day, where there is still a lot of inequity that exists and a lot of need that many communities face, right? So Verity has always had a mission on how do we do banking for good? And I think for us, especially being a CDFI, as of 2 years ago, we got our certification. It really cemented that mission, right, as a community development financial institution.
So was that a natural progression of what you were doing, or was there like a deliberate effort to say, hey, we're changing our approach, so we should go after all the advantages that maybe align with what you're doing from being a CDFI?
Yeah, I think that was a natural progression. This kind of predates me, of course, and even our CEO. But even when our CEO, Tanita Webb, who joined the credit union about 3 years ago, came on board, the focus was there. And for her especially, right, one of the reasons she was selected is just a lot of the work she's done in this space for CDFIs and historically underserved communities. And so it was a natural progression in that. And then once we received that certification, again, it just created a lot of alignment internally for us and in community around where we're focusing and what we're doing, especially in some of the spaces we're going to talk about today.
So what are some of like the big initiatives? I know we talked ahead of time a little bit about home ownership, but what else are, kind of like the top line things that Verity looks to address?
Yeah, I want to talk really quick just about our mission, because that was a recent adjustment. And I think that will kind of speak to some of the focus areas that we have. So our mission is we co-create with and advocate for pathways to generational wealth to build thriving and sustainable communities, right? Really the thriving and sustainable community. A lot of the focus for us has been in the spaces of addressing inequities around affordable homeownership, specifically the racial wealth gap, being able to address access to affordable banking programs and services.
And do you typically do that on your own? Is this like your own initiatives, or do you have like a partner-led approach? Is this something you work with NGOs, nonprofits, other organizations like that, or?
Absolutely. To create systemic change, it's going to take all of us. So this is definitely in partnership with, I'll speak to one of those partnerships called the Black Homeownership Initiative in Washington State, really with focusing on addressing the racial wealth gap for Black families and families of color. And so really the opportunity and the ways in which we can create programs or products to focus on that. One of the mentions I want to state is around our relationship with HomeSite, which is a nonprofit organization. We actually created a partnership around limited equity co-ops, which is a relatively newer concept in Washington State. It's not something that's really prevalent around here. Mainly you see that on the East Coast, but with the disparities in homeownership and the rising costs for owning a single family home or any type of home, condo, whatever it may be, even the raising rental costs, this was really a way that we could kind of address some of those inequities that existed there.
So what's involved in a limited equity co-op? Like, what's the role of the credit union in that?
Yeah, so we actually will provide the limited equity co-op loans. And we'll actually have a branch location within where the limited equity co-op is to really, again, create accessible opportunities for families and individuals to enter into the banking system. A lot of the loans could be, I'm going to quote, but around 80,000, which is unheard of for a home. The co-op has about 68 affordable housing units. And so HomeSite will, of course, be the builder on those units. And then we come alongside and provide that lending, which is a very collaborative type of model to be able to do. They're definitely the expert in kind of building these spaces, and we're somewhat of the expert in regards to being able to provide the products to meet the needs of community.
So are you serving the builder, the developer in that case, or the ultimate homeowner, and something
The
that looks
ultimate
and smells
homeowner.
like so this is kind of like mortgage work from that
Yes.
standpoint. Okay.
Yeah, similar, yes. And so folks to qualify need to meet 80% AMI, area median income, or lower. And there is preference, again, kind of to address gentrification, right? Folks kind of being displaced outside of the South Seattle community is where it will be, but they're given preference to be able to apply. And so we have a program where we work directly with HomeSite and the financial coaches or counselors. And then we come alongside to be able to provide that product specifically for folks to enter into home ownership.
So from a financing standpoint, do you go it alone on this, or do you have like other financial institutions that you're working with?
We are alone on this specific project, yes. In the greater partnership, the umbrella of the Black Homeownership Initiative, there are actually other financial institutions that are a part of that. But for the, which is called Othello, this is the project specifically, the Othello Limited Equity Co-op.
There's an interesting element to this, and we were talking about this ahead of time. Research that had come out of the Fed, and I know the Brookings Institute had done some work on this, where they were looking at what are the different contributions to household wealth and the disparities by wealth, and what are the sources of them. And specifically, they were looking like in a post-COVID era, right? It was what did 2020 to 2023 look like? And one of the big headlines from the report was how home ownership and the appreciation of home equity was the biggest contributor and the biggest kind of thing that began to close the wealth gap between specifically Black and white households. The effect was less in other ones, but specifically for Black households was a big one. So we'll put a link to that report. Who else is really involved in this from the bank standpoint? Is this something that kind of falls under just like community outreach, home ownership initiatives, or does it broadly go beyond that, like into operations and how you do other things from a banking standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, this is a cross departments, right? A cross departmental effort, really an organizational strategy and focus, right? Affordable home ownership and the different ways in which as an organization we're committed. And so we do, from a standpoint of kind of building the product, right? Our chief lending officer, Tina Naran, was the first in being able to bring that here and working with her team at Verity to really make that come to fruition, as well as obviously there's an element of if someone's to come into the branch, there's the awareness around what exactly we're doing in community. And so it does take us all in being able to make sure that it's a success in being able to partner and focus on these initiatives overall. And it's a commitment all the way from our board, CEO, executive leadership, and on throughout the organization. And so this is a mission for us. It's not just pick the flavor of the month and focus in on that. Something that we didn't talk about, Rich, too, is one of the things that we're also focused in within affordable housing is the Evergreen Impact Housing Fund, which is actually a collaboration amongst credit unions in the greater Seattle area with pooling funding together to be able to build affordable units. So not just from like an ownership standpoint, but even from a rental standpoint. And one of the ones that we recently did was Copper Way in Spanaway, Washington, which is further down south, actually close to the military base, and really finding ways to create those opportunities for rentals, right? For folks that, again, are within the 80% area median income and to be able to rent into that. Because as you pointed out in the surveys and research, even just amongst ownership, talk about the disparities in being able to rent. it's just unaffordable these days to even rent a house or an apartment.
And so in that case, you're pooling funds with other credit unions?
Other credit unions.
You said it was the Evergreen
Impact Housing Fund.
Impact. Okay. But that's all nonprofit credit unions that are participating in that.
Not for profit. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So let me ask like the flip side of this. Like, what's the hard part, right? Like, obviously you're addressing something that has a systemic disparity to it. What I mean, other than showing up and having the money, right? Like, what's the difficult part for really executing on it?
Yeah. I mean, I can't pinpoint just one thing, right? We could talk about the system that's been here for 300 plus years that have created these inequities and really contributed to that growing disparity. I think we are regulated, right? So sometimes there does take a partnership to be able to figure out what do we need to do to make sure that this works for everyone and that we're still able to uphold and be safe and sound as a credit union for our members, for our community. And sometimes it's the pioneering of being the first or not necessarily having a blueprint that may work in Washington state, but it works somewhere else, right? So it's really being able to infuse equity, and equity isn't always present. So for us, it's really important as a financial institution to be able to listen to our community. And so we're big on how do we co-create this with community partners that may have some parts of that blueprint and we can come in and our community. So it's just a lot of mix of things. And sometimes it's hard to tell, especially with the economy, right? Who knew we were going to be in a pandemic and the implications of that? It's just a matter of for us to really make sure that we're able to sustain and weather through with our community partners on some of these large initiatives and really to be able to create that systemic change.
A lot of the institutions we talk to, particularly ones that have fairly robust CRA, Community Reinvestment Act programs that are, looking at, boy, we talked to an institution, I believe in the Atlanta area that was looking at housing that was, at the 30% level from an income standpoint. They were talking about like, we're building housing that the alternative is somebody sleeping in their car, right? Like that was the level of poverty that they were addressing. And the bigger issue wasn't necessarily access to capital, because obviously being a CDFI, you get some advantages from grants, et cetera, otherwise. But it was also fighting the whole NIMBYism aspect of, the not having the right stakeholders from a community standpoint on board. And, that for things that take maybe years to execute, that sometimes can be an issue. Have you found that to be the case?
Yeah. I mean, whose voice is missing in the space? Are we duplicating efforts? This project that I talked about in Othello specifically, it's taken years and there's been some bumps in that journey with the pandemic introduced into that. And so I think it is kind of a combination of all. And sometimes it's also as a financial institution or a credit union, sometimes we can be in the way, even just with maybe not understanding fully and taking the time necessary. And it really does take an approach of also listening to other experts in the space and not coming in and saying we have all the answers, but here's what we can do, right? Here's where we can be very transparent and what are the possibilities, and let's make space to be able to dream and innovate together.
So what role has the community placed in this, right? Like how much of this is, you guys having the master plan and like kind of executing from that standpoint versus the feedback and involvement of whether it's your members or people that are just in your served community? How do you incorporate that into like how you execute and plan and, address some of those things?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I mean, with Othello specifically, there were town halls that were led by Homesite and in partnership with a lot of the other key stakeholders that were there. And so really taking that in and being able to craft from what community was saying their needs were and saying, does this kind of align with what you're speaking to? Other times for us, it's really been, how can we ensure that we're surveying our members and really taking in feedback? This may not apply here necessarily, but overdraft protection is a large one that a lot of discussions happen on. And we surveyed our members or folks that were impacted by overdraft protection. And so really trying to make sure that we're incorporating that feedback through. Another example I could give is around our micro grant program specifically, which focuses on small business, specifically nonprofits, and taking in their feedback on the application process and then incorporating that and sharing that out. And so it's just being able to really, we like to talk about piloting, like to talk about phasing and creating those iterative processes within that, all while checking with communities or our members to see, is this serving what your needs are, right? Or do we miss the mark? And being able to make adjustments from there. But you do have to be nimble. And sometimes you have to look in the mirror and kind of swallow. Yeah, that was hard. We created some harm there.
So how do you measure impact beyond traditional, bank FI measures of success, risk, et cetera? How are you looking this and, things from like reporting or working with your partners or communities? Like what are the things that you look at or measure that kind of tell you you're on the right path?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of that we're still building because we are a newer CDFI, and even my department, community impact within the organization, is somewhat newer. But I will say some of the things that we have done are being able to measure, for instance, small business loans. And who are those loans going to, right? We have a focus on BIPOC, women, veteran-owned businesses, queer-owned businesses. And so being able to measure against, are we actually giving loans out to communities we say we're focused on? Being able to see the ways in which our products and how they impact our members. So again, the feedback tool being the survey, have we addressed some of the barriers that folks have stated or exist in our process? And so really, because we are a CDFI, some of those things are written for us to serve low to moderate income communities, but we're really doing the work necessary to ensure that infrastructure is there to sustain that and that we are able to track that. So I'll say check in with me in about a year and I'll have even more around how that has developed. But for us, it's just a matter of, are we saying what we are doing and how are we showing that work, both through quantitative and qualitative data?
And is that something that, at least an understanding that this is a development and you're kind of still working on it, but is this something where you have very concrete, measurable goals as you're going after from year to year from a planning standpoint? Or is it just, hey, we're at the let's do better than last year kind of stage?
Yeah, I would say we definitely do have goals that are set up. A lot of our focus has been around infrastructure, especially as the CDFI, and there are goals that we are building there. And then as far as some of the things that I stated, we call it our triple bottom line. We do measure that, and we measure how well the financial institution is doing overall to be able to sustain and weather, right, economic hardships. So there's a multitude of things that we do measure and that we build on. And as I said before, a lot of that is continuing to be built as we speak.
Triple bottom line traditionally is, in addition to financial measures, it's social and environmental, correct?
Environmental, yep.
Okay. And that's kind of like how you lay that out from a planning standpoint?
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Well, this has been very interesting, Ziquora. Thank you for sharing your story and Verity story. If people are interested in learning more about what you're doing or the programs or some of the partnerships that you're part of, where can they go to learn more?
Yeah, they can go to veritycu.com.
Okay, we'll put a link to there and your impact report from 2023, which is a very interesting read to kind of look at that. So, Ziquora, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Rich.